In at number 10 with Gary Gilmore. During a robbery, Gilmore shot a man twice in the head, even though he was cooperating with his demand. The next day, he attempted to rob a motel, and he ended up fatally shooting the manager in the head. He confessed to the police that he killed 2 people in cold blood, but he was only tried for one of the murders because there wasn't enough physical evidence against him for the other murder. I mean, what the heck? If someone admits to a crime, isn't that enough? Well, the judge sentenced him to a death penalty, and he had a choice of being executed by hanging or shot by a firing squad. I guess he's a fan of irony because he chose to get killed by a firing squad. And his infamous last words were, "Let's do it." Those definitely wouldn't be my final words. I'd probably be screaming. I think Nike must have been inspired by his final last words. Let's do it.
Moving on at number 9, we have Robert Alton Harris. Robert Alton Harris was an American kidnapper, thief, and murderer. He was convicted for the murder of 2 boys in San Diego. On April 21st, 1992, he was sentenced to death via gas chamber. But first, let's talk about his last meal. This guy went all out. He had KFC, 2 large pizzas, a bag of jelly beans, and a 6-pack of Pepsi. Now, his last words were, "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everyone dances with the Grim Reaper." This is actually a misquote from the 1991 film Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. Nonetheless, pretty creepy. Making our way down the list at number 8, we have Clarence Ray Allen. Clarence Ray Allen was an American criminal who played a role in killing 3 people. In 1974, Clarence was on trial for the murder of his son's girlfriend. He had 8 witnesses testify against him. And guess what? He hired a hitman to kill those witnesses. The hitman successfully killed 3 of them and then was caught and turned Clarence in. Clarence died by lethal injection on January 17, 2006. His last words were, "Hoka hey, it's a good day to die. Thank you very much, I love you all, goodbye." Wow. In our 7th spot, we have Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos, often referred to as the Damsel of Death, killed 7 men. She murdered them, robbed them, and then drove home in their cars. Due to this, she was named America's first female serial killer. Now, she does claim that it was all self-defense and that they tried to assault her, but her stories of the events were very inconsistent. In fact, during an interview with a filmmaker, she claims that it was self-defense, but that she couldn't stand being on death row any longer since she had already been there for 10 years, and she just wanted to die, so that's why she confessed to killing the men. On October 9th, 2002, she was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Her last words were a reference from the movie Independence Day. She said, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie Big Mothership and all, I'll be back." Now, people often cut this quote down and say that her last words were just, "I'll be back," but either way, it's pretty creepy and kind of like the Terminator, like, "I'll be back." Moving on at number 6, we have Andre Chikatilo. Andre Chikatilo was a serial killer that confessed to murdering over 50 women. The murders took place from 1978 to 1990. In fact, he's been deemed one of history's sickest serial killers. On February 14th, 1994, he was executed by a gunshot to the head. Just before his death, he said, "Don't blow my brains out, the Japanese want to buy them." And then he was shot and killed. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Carl Panzram. Charles, or Carl Panzram, was an American serial killer, robber, and arsonist. He claims to have murdered 22 individuals. However, only a handful of them have been proved. In his autobiography that he wrote in prison, he also states that he committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, and arsons. On September 5th, 1930, at the age of 39, Carl was killed by being hung. His last words were, "Hurry up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill 10 men while you're fooling around." In our 4th spot, we have H.H. Holmes. Herman Webster Mudgett, otherwise known as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, or H.H. Holmes, was an American serial killer. In 1886, he moved to Chicago and got a job as a pharmacist under the name Dr. H.H. Holmes. However, he was killing people in order to steal their properties. He also got his employees to write him down as a beneficiary so that he would get all the money after he killed them. And then he would sell the bodies of his victims to medical schools. On top of that, he owned a house that was referred to as the murder castle. Basically, his home had secret passages, trapdoors, soundproof rooms, gas chambers, and a kiln to cremate the bodies. Eventually, he admitted to 27 murders. However, only 9 were confirmed. Yet, officials believe he had killed closer to 200 individuals. On May 7th, 1896, he was hung. His last words were, "Take your time. Don't bungle it." Moving on to number 3, we have George Engel. George Engel was an anarchist and con artist. He was thought to be involved in the 1886 bombing in Haymarket Square. Although the night of the bombing, Engel was home, he was arrested and charged with conspiracy in the bombing. He was hung on November 11th, 1887. Just before being hung, he said, "Hurrah for anarchy! This is the happiest moment of my life." In our second spot, we have Tom Ketchum. Tom Ketchum, otherwise known as Black Jack, was a famous cowboy that later turned into an outlaw. He committed several robberies and crimes. In 1901, he was caught after a failed train robbery. Looks like they did catch him. Get it? I know, it's bad. While attempting to rob the train, he was shot in the arm and later captured by the police. On April 26, 1901, he was sentenced to death by hanging. His last words were, "I'll be in hell before you start breakfast, boys. Let her rip." Pretty scary. But that's not the worst part. Apparently, the hanging didn't go according to plan. The night before, the executioner tested the rope with a 200-pound sandbag, but then forgot to remove it. So when they went to hang Ketchum, this caused his entire head to just be decapitated. His body then fell to the floor and apparently remained upright on its feet for quite some time. And in our number 1 spot, we have the Dusseldorf Vampire. Peter Kürten, also known as the Dusseldorf Vampire or the Dusseldorf Monster, was a German serial killer. He was responsible for the deaths of around 60 people. And in one case, he actually drank the blood of one of his victims. Hence why they call him the vampire. On July 2nd, 1931, Peter was sentenced to death by the guillotine. But just before he was beheaded, he said this, "Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." Starting off this countdown, we have the Russian Girl. This message was written by a Russian girl named Vala Barin. Her and her husband were caught and jailed by the secret police of Nazi Germany. The final messages that she left on her cell wall were heartbreaking. This is what she wrote, and I quote, "Here was held in custody Vala Barin, who was betrayed by her own Russian compatriots. My husband and I were both put away in one cell. Another 3 Russian civilians and 1 prisoner of war were in the same cell. They had pistols. We will be facing the gallows. My only regret is to be separated from the beloved husband and the whole wide world." This message really displays the horrors of that time. An innocent woman and her husband locked away, just waiting for their turn to be hung. It really is quite terrifying.
Climbing up this list, and at number 9, we're talking about Erskine Childers. Now, I know what you guys must be thinking. Everyone on this list must have committed a horrible crime in order to get the death penalty. Well, he might be our one exception to this rule. Childers was actually an Irish author who wrote a lot of successful novels, but he also had a little bit of a dark side. He would smuggle guns into Ireland with his sailing yacht until he was caught and sentenced to death. I mean, this seems pretty harsh, but this was during the late 1800s. But what makes things even worse, he filed an appeal and it was pending when they executed him, which is highly illegal today. So before he was executed by a firing squad, he said, "Take a step forward, lads. It will be easier that way." I don't blame him for being bitter. I think this was a pretty cruel and unusual punishment for his crime. Number 8, we have Jimmy Glass, who said, "I'd rather be fishing. Yeah, no shit. I think I'd rather be in a cave of sleeping grizzly bears or at a One Direction concert than be on the chopping block about to die." It's like Jimmy doesn't really give a shit that he's about to die. I think he must have come to terms with his death, because those definitely aren't inspiring or moving last words. I wonder what he picked to be engraved on his tombstone. I'd rather be alive. But before you start feeling sorry for him, just know that he was a convicted murderer, so he had it coming. John Avalos Alba brings us to number 7. He was handed down the death penalty for fatally shooting his wife while he was out on bail for a child molestation charge. He was finally executed by lethal injection on May 25th, 2010. I bet the judge who set his bail was feeling really guilty for not setting it higher. So for his final statement on Earth, he said this airy line: "Okay, Warden, let's do it. I love ya. I can taste it already. I'm starting to go." I mean, that just gives me chills. I read that you can feel the cold rush of the lethal injection piercing through your veins. Probably the worst feeling ever. And of course, it's the last feeling ever. I don't know whether or not that's true, but I guess I don't care to know. And now, in at our number 6 spot, we have a really odd last words. James French was a convicted murderer, and he was actually the last person to be executed under Oklahoma's death penalty. He was a pretty violent man. He was already convicted to life in prison for murdering a man who had picked him up from hitchhiking, but he had the desire to die, so that's when he brutally murdered his cellmate in order to get the death penalty. As soon as he was prepped to be executed by the electric chair, he came up with these infamous last words. How's this for a headline? French fries? Do you guys get it? His last name was French, and he was about to get fried by the electric chair. I know I shouldn't be laughing, but it's a little clever. From one scary but clever final statement to another, in at number 5 is George Apple. He said, "Well, gentlemen, you are about to see a baked apple." I would like to think I was given the opportunity for a final statement. I would say something clever like this, but it's also pretty morbid if you think about it, so actually maybe I would use the opportunity to say something wise. Well, thankfully I don't really have to think about it because I don't intend to ever be on death row. But anyways, George Apple was originally sentenced to death for committing an evil murder, so I guess he had it coming. Now number 4 brings us to John Rook. In 1980, he kidnapped a 25-year-old nurse in a parking lot where she worked. She was taken to an empty field where she was abused and murdered by Rook. After the killing, he ran her body over with his car. I mean, wow, was that even necessary? After he was sentenced to death, he made several appeals, but they all failed. So on the day of his execution, he said, "Freedom! Freedom at last! It's been a good one. Well, I hope you enjoy your freedom, and I'm glad you won't be able to hurt anyone ever again." Tory Twain McNabb takes us to number 3 on our list. He was executed by lethal injection for killing a police officer back in 1997. His lawyers attempted to make an appeal stating that the state's execution methods was cruel and unusual, but the judge was pretty firm and declined their appeals. So during his final minutes, he said, "Mom, sis, look at my eyes. I got no tears. I am unafraid. To the state of Alabama, I hate you. I hate you. I hate you." And as the procedure began, he raised his middle finger to the police officers, and he actually died in that position. I mean, wow, what an honorable way to go. Not. And now at number 2 is Carlos Hernandez. During a heated argument with his girlfriend, he grabbed a large kitchen knife and stabbed her 3-year-old son. I mean, whoa, talk about anger management issues. And he also stabbed his girlfriend 30 times, but she survived and was able to testify against him in court. For his final meal, he requested fried chicken, pizza, and a soft drink. And right before he was given the lethal injection, he said, "Kathy, you know I never meant to hurt you. I gave you everything. And that's what made me so angry. But I never meant to hurt you. I'm sorry." Well, I think it's a little bit too late for an apology. I hope she didn't even show up to his execution. Topping off this morbid list, in at number 1, we have Peter Manuel. He is actually known as Scotland's worst serial killer ever. He was convicted of murdering a total of 7 people between the years of 1956 and 1958, but it is believed that he killed many more people. He was hanged at Glasgow's Barlinnie prison, and he was one of the last people to have ever been executed in these gallows ever since the death penalty was overturned. But before he stepped out to his death, he said, "Turn up the radio and I'll go quietly." There's just something about that statement that gives me the chills.
Starting off this countdown, we have Jeffrey Dahmer. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this infamous serial killer. Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster, was an American serial killer who murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys from 1878 to 1991. He would pack the victims' body parts into plastic bags and bury them behind his parents' home. Upon searching his home, police found albums full of pictures of body parts, and his place was filled with human remains. Heads were in the fridge and freezer, 2 skulls were on display, and a 57-gallon drum filled with decomposing bodies was found in his room. On top of that, there was evidence that Dahmer would eat some of his victims. On November 28, 1994, he was beaten to death by an inmate. His last words were, "I don't care if I live or die. Go ahead and kill me." In our 9th spot today, we have the watchful eye. This next piece of graffiti was found in the abandoned West Virginia penitentiary. It says, "I'm watching you, Freddy-O." Now, I don't know who Freddy-O is, and I don't really want to know, but I feel bad for them. That is absolutely terrifying. Someone was keeping a watchful eye on him. The eye itself also just looks horrifying, like it's staring right into my soul. Ooh. Moving on to number 8, we have Aaron Hernandez. Aaron Hernandez was an American football player in the NFL for 3 seasons. However, in 2013, he was arrested for the death of his friend, Odin Lloyd. In the end, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. But in 2017, Aaron took his life in jail. Before doing so, he apparently cut his finger and wrote John 3:16 on the wall in his own blood. He also wrote it on his forehead as well. John 3:16 said that God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall never die, but have eternal life. Not only that, but another report said that he drew an unfinished pyramid with the all-seeing eye on the wall as well, which is hella creepy. Like, why did he do that? What is this supposed to mean? I'm creeped out. In our 7th spot today, we have Welcome Home. This next message was captured by photographer Mark Perot. He got a tour of Eastern State Penitentiary, and he was just going there to capture the empty building and the abandoned rooms. But while there, he found a deeper connection to the graffiti on the prison cell walls. So he started to photograph that instead. In one cell, a prisoner left a very creepy, welcoming message. It says, "Welcome home, convict." Now, we're not sure if the person who wrote the message was freed or ended up dying in jail, but we do know that that was one of his final messages. And it was to the person who would be taking over his room. But it's not really a warm welcoming if you ask me. Coming in at number 6, we have the hanging tree. This next message left by a prisoner is fairly dark. Basically, the prisoner drew himself being hung from a tree. The words, "This is my family tree," are written by it with arrows. Clearly, this message has a deeper meaning. One can interpret that he meant his family tree, or family bloodline, ends after his death. We can assume he never had kids, so after his death, that's the end of their family name. I guess he has no other siblings or living relatives, which is dark as hell. This prisoner was later found in his room dead. He hung himself with his bedsheet. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the Gallows. In 2014, a jail in Windsor was allowing visitors to come in and go on guided tours. This, of course, was after the prison was decommissioned and the inmates were moved to another prison. Now, this prison is eerie for a number of reasons. Number 1, the jail had a built-in gallows, which they used up until the death penalty was removed in 1976. But before that, they were hanging prisoners right there in the very prison. To this day, the trap door as well as the bolts where the ropes used to hang are still visible. Not only that, but the cells are filled with scary graffiti. The government has since tried to get this graffiti removed, but this is pretty creepy. This was the last message written by an inmate before he got moved to the new facility. It says, "We are moving southwest, so don't hang around." The end. Obviously, hang was a play on words. Just knowing the history of that prison makes that message that much more darker. In our 4th spot today, we have the hit list. For this one, let's take a trip to Bogo Road Jail in Australia. So this jail had a strict set of rules. Prisoners were not allowed to write on or deface their cell walls. Any graffiti that was spotted was quickly removed. But in 1989, they started to let this slide since the jail was facing closure. This was one of the eerie messages they found in one of the cells. This is the list of prison officers that worked at this jail. It was written as a threat to scare the officers that the inmates didn't like. It was also meant to scare any new officers coming in. Kind of like, you're next. I don't know about you, but if I walked in and saw my name on that list and knew that they were coming after me, I'd walk right back out. Moving on at number 3, we have the dead man's gun. This eerie message was left by a prisoner who was on death row. It was hard to find a lot of information on him, but basically he was put on death row after being convicted of killing a man after they found his fingerprints on the murder weapon. But according to the prisoner, he was never able to tell his full side of the story. He never confessed and always maintained that he was innocent. He did witness the murder of his friend and made the mistake of picking up the murder weapon, but he had nothing to do with the actual murder. That's what he was trying to get at with this final message. Moving on at number 2, we have the bloodbath. This next creepy message was left in the showers of a now abandoned prison. Clearly, someone didn't like what another prisoner was doing and left this message as a warning. It says, "This is what will happen next time. Bloodbath." Isn't that just great? I hope no one ever crossed this prisoner again. I would hate to see the outcome of that. And in the number 1 spot today, we have the Craigslist Killer. Philip Markoff, better known as the Craigslist Killer, is responsible for taking the life of Jalissa Brisman on April 14th, 2009. Markoff got his name because he would go on Craigslist and respond to sexual ads, meet up with them before attacking and robbing them. He received immense gratification from doing so, but in the end, he was caught. His final words were directed to his fiancée, Megan, who he had given the nickname Pocket to. On August 15th, 2010, Markoff took his own life in his cell. As he was bleeding out, he left one final message in blood. He wrote Megan's name along with Pocket on the wall. The words he wrote itself aren't scary, but it's the fact that he wrote this when he was bleeding out and dying. In fact, Markoff made sure he wasn't going to come back from this. Officers found toilet paper shoved down his throat so that they couldn't resuscitate him.